of his stories in the book was, I think, was it William Sherman?
Yeah.
I hope I've got this right. But he was very happy with his position, and in fact, he insisted that if he did a good job, he wouldn't get promoted.
Yeah.
Because he didn't feel that that would be the right position for him. And in fact, he didn't want to become president.
Yes. Yeah, he famously gives what they now call the Sherman-esque statement.
Yes.
I think he says, "If I am nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve." But what?
But isn't that the very person that we want? The person that doesn't want to run.
Yeah, there's an interesting, Sam Walker is a great writer, and he did a New York Wall Street Journal piece about this recently. He talks about sort of like reluctant leaders, that, you know, many of the best American presidents like didn't want to be president. They were kind of like drafted for it. Yeah. And many of the ones who wanted to be president their whole lives were like the worst ones. And I think the point is, like, what's interesting about someone like Sherman is he's probably one of the greatest military minds of that era, you know, but there wasn't like that sort of Napoleonic sense of destiny, like the world is mine and I will conquer it and, you know, I'm destined for greatness. Like that sort of entitlement and ego often ends up destroying a person, even if they're so talented that they're able to sort of balance that for a long time. And there's this great quote from one of Sherman's biographers where he talks about actually how much more pleasant it would have been to be Sherman, to be like pleasantly surprised by his continual success, like this sort of iterative, and you know, this idea that, like, you know, in a way, it's like if you think you should be president or a general at like 7 years old, like there's something wrong with you, because like you have no evidence that you're qualified to do that, right? And so, you know, the people who sort of do it a little bit more iteratively or slowly, the accumulation of confidence, I think, is a healthier way to live, and it also takes, you know, into account just like the sort of sheer random luck that is part of a lot of the rise of these people. So I was kind of trying to look at, like, you know, originally I was going to write about humility. The problem with humility as a topic in a book is that it's not very inspiring. You know, it's like, so-and-so didn't do this, you know, or, you know, so-and-so turned down the job, or, you know, so-and-so, you know, declined to accept the compliment, or, you know, like, it's not, so I wanted to look more at, like, first time I wanted to look at cautionary tales, like American Apparel being one of them, but, or you know, the DeLorean Motor Company, or Richard Nixon. I want to look at people who had torn themselves apart, because I sort of take it for granted that everyone in this room, like, wants to do things. Like, you have potential you want to reach, you have goals you want to accomplish. I don't think that's ego. I think that's what makes the world work. But the problem is ego is something that can ultimately get in the way of that. And then so I also wanted to look at, I think there's a kind of also a survivorship bias to a lot of the sort of stories that we have. So we hear about Kanye West more than another rapper who's just as talented, maybe more influential, or you know, sort of you know, more of a genius, because they don't want the attention. Do you know what I mean? And so it's always like the sort of train wrecks and the egomaniacs and the people who have to be the center of attention, who naturally end up being the center of attention. So I wanted to look at interesting people who had accomplished like a whole hell of a lot in their life, but done it from some place that it came from a deeper place than ego. So, for instance, in the book I talk about, like, I sort of contrast, you know, Douglas MacArthur and George Marshall. You know, George Marshall is probably much more an architect of the 20th century, but less sort of a media figure, you know, less sort of a cultivator of his image and personal brand, you know, less interested in headlines, you know, didn't want the Marshall Plan to be called the Marshall Plan. He only consented to it being called he wanted it to be called the Truman Plan because Truman was the president, and Truman said, if it's called the Truman Plan, Congress will not approve it because you have been, like, basically what, just getting a bit on the tangent, but what's so interesting about someone like Marshall, who I'm fascinated with, is like the two big moments in Marshall's career. So one is that he declines it to be called, he lends his name to the Marshall Plan, which allows it to be passed, because he cultivated so assiduously a reputation of not doing anything for himself. And the other moment earlier on in the Second World War, he goes to Congress and he says, like, look, I need like several $100 million for this project. I can't tell you what it's for. You'll have no insight for it. And it's going to be, like it could potentially change the entire balance of power in the world. He was talking about the Manhattan Project. And you can imagine Congress is not in the business of just handing blank checks to people, but because Marshall had been so famously unselfish his entire career, not been a self-promoter, not ever had a whiff of corruption or a whiff of bias, they were like, sure, and so actually, sort of in the short term, maybe people go, oh, but if I'm not promoting myself, I won't get ahead. Yeah, maybe in the short term, but it's ultimately the really important things that we entrust to those people who have sort of, shown us to be, people of character and commitment and purpose.